The morning sun barely kissed the edges of Atlanta's skyline when Emma Walker's alarm buzzed sharply at 6:30 a.m. She didn't have to be in court until 9 a.m., but years as a federal prosecutor had instilled in her the importance of preparation. Emma's downtown Atlanta apartment mirrored her disciplined nature. Her home office desk held neatly stacked case files, and her court attire was always laid out the night before. But today wasn't like her usual mornings. Emma wasn't heading to the federal courthouse, where she typically commanded attention as a lead assistant U.S. attorney. Instead, she was handling a mundane personal errand, contesting a parking ticket at the municipal court. She believed the ticket was unjust and had the evidence to prove it. Choosing to dress less formally than usual, Emma opted for a crisp navy blazer over a white blouse and black pants. As she studied her reflection in the bathroom mirror, she carefully pinned back her natural curls, which she had recently embraced after years of straightening. At 36, Emma's face carried the confidence of someone who had worked hard to graduate top of her class at Spelman College before earning her law degree. Her rise to prominence in the U.S. Attorney's Office had been swift, but well-earned. "It's just a quick appearance," she reassured herself while grabbing a banana and filling her travel mug with freshly brewed coffee. In the parking garage, her metallic blue Audi gleamed, a reward she had purchased after winning a significant corruption trial. The car was a source of pride, though she'd grown used to the surprised looks it drew when people saw a young black woman stepping out of it. The downtown traffic crawled along as the city stirred to life. Emma, unbothered, had left with ample time to spare. She turned on NPR, letting the familiar rhythm of the morning news anchor her as she mentally rehearsed her argument for the ticket dispute. The parking signs had been contradictory, and Emma had photographs ready to bolster her case. At 8:15 a.m., her car's Bluetooth chimed, interrupting her focus. The screen displayed a call from her boss, U.S. Attorney Robert Harris. Emma's pulse quickened. A direct call from him at this hour was never casual. "Emma, I'm sorry for the early call," Harris began, his voice tense but composed. "We've got an issue with the Carter trafficking case. The defense just filed a last-minute motion that could jeopardize the prosecution. I need your input immediately." Emma's grip on the steering wheel tightened. The Carter case was one of Georgia's most significant human trafficking prosecutions in recent history. "Understood, sir," she replied, her tone professional. "What's the deadline?" "The judge has given us until noon to respond. I've just sent the documents to your email. Can you review them and get back to me with your analysis?" "Of course," Emma answered, her mind already racing. She had planned to park by 8:30 a.m., leaving time to find the right courtroom. Now she needed to adjust. She quickly pulled into a nearby coffee shop's parking lot, parking under the shade of an old oak tree. Opening her laptop, Emma tethered it to her phone's hotspot and began reviewing the motion. The defense's arguments were intricate, and Emma's focus sharpened as she worked to dissect each point. Her fingers flew across the keyboard as she jotted down detailed notes. When she finally glanced at her watch, her heart sank. It was 8:50 a.m. The municipal court was still 10 minutes away, and parking would take additional time. Emma called her boss back, concisely summarizing her findings and committing to a more thorough review later that morning. Then, merging back into the sluggish traffic, she tried to talk earnings. The Carter case could potentially change the lives of dozens, and the motion filed that morning held the power to jeopardize the entire prosecution. By the time Emma Walker pulled into the municipal court parking lot, it was already 9:10 a.m. Hurrying toward the courthouse steps, she felt her phone buzz. It was a message from her boss, U.S. Attorney Robert Harris, thanking her for the swift analysis she had provided earlier. A small smile crossed Emma's face. At least the delay had been worth it. What she didn't realize, however, was that her slightly late arrival was about to set off a series of events that would bring to light the deeply ingrained biases within the system she had spent her career defending. Inside, Judge Albert Monroe's courtroom was bustling. Known for his strict demeanor and unyielding adherence to procedure, Judge Monroe had spent over 3 decades building a reputation as a no-nonsense authority figure. At 62, With thinning gray hair and round glasses, he presided over the courtroom like a general commanding his troops. The courtroom was already filled with people awaiting their turn. 23 in total. Many there for minor infractions like parking tickets, traffic violations, and other small disputes. Judge Monroe, seated in his elevated chair in a perfectly pressed black robe, surveyed the room. His sharp gaze lingered approvingly on the white professionals dressed neatly in business attire, their documents impeccably organized. At exactly 9 a.m., the bailiff's voice rang out, "All rise." Judge Monroe entered, beginning his day with mechanical efficiency. He prided himself on running a tight ship, moving through the docket swiftly and decisively. To him, tardiness was an affront to the law itself, a reflection of poor character. At 9:15 a.m., the door to the courtroom creaked open, and Emma slipped in quietly, doing her best not to disrupt the ongoing proceedings. But Judge Monroe immediately stopped mid-sentence, his piercing gaze locking onto her. His expression hardened as he noticed the young black woman entering late. "Step forward," he barked, his voice sharp enough to halt the murmurs in the room. The case he had been addressing was abruptly forgotten. Emma approached the podium, standing tall and composed despite the judge's cold reception. "You must be Miss Walker, scheduled for 9 a.m., Judge Monroe said, emphasizing the time with a note of disdain. "Do you believe your time is more valuable than the court's time, Miss Walker?" Before Emma could respond, he continued, his tone rising with each word as though determined to make her an example. "In this courtroom, we follow rules," he lectured, shuffling papers for dramatic effect without actually looking at her documentation. "This isn't some casual gathering where you can arrive as you please. This is a court of law." Emma remained calm, her hands folded neatly in front of her. She noted how Judge Monroe hadn't even glanced at her case file or credentials. His assumptions were evident, in the dismissive tone he used, in the way his eyes skimmed over her professional attire, as though it didn't matter. In the corner of the room, the bailiff, a seasoned officer named Leonard Brown, watched the interaction closely. Leonard, a black man who had served in the courtroom for over 15 years, recognized the judge's tone all too well. He had seen this pattern play out more times than he could count. Catching Emma's eye for a moment, he gave her a subtle, understanding nod. "Your Honor, if I may explain," Emma began, her voice steady and respectful. "You may not," Judge Monroe snapped, cutting her off before she could finish. "I've heard every excuse there is. Car trouble, traffic, personal emergencies. None of that matters. The time was set for 9 a.m., and this court expects punctuality." A few murmurs rippled through the gallery as Emma stood silently, letting the judge's words hang in the air. She refused to let her composure falter. Leonard Brown's jaw tightened as he listened, his posture stiffening. He had seen earlier how a white businessman, also late, had been met with barely a mention of his tardiness. Yet here was Emma, being publicly reprimanded with unnecessary fervor. Emma glanced around the room and noticed the discomfort on several faces, particularly from a young black woman seated a few rows back. The disparities in treatment were glaring to everyone in the room, even if Judge Monroe seemed oblivious. Emma took a breath, steadying herself. She had spent her career standing up against injustice and prejudice, and today would be no different. Judge Albert Monroe lifted his gavel, the weight of it seeming to amplify his authority. The courtroom fell silent, all eyes fixed on him. A young white woman, who had arrived at 9:10 a.m., sat quietly in the back row, her tardiness completely overlooked. The pattern was becoming increasingly evident to everyone except, it seemed, Judge Monroe himself. "This court will not tolerate such blatant disregard for its procedures," Judge Monroe declared, his face growing flushed with irritation. He turned his gaze back to Emma Walker, who stood at the podium with poise and composure. It wasn't defiance. It was restraint, born from years of experience as a federal prosecutor. Yet to the judge her calm demeanor was a challenge. "Perhaps a fine will remind you of the importance of punctuality," he continued, his tone dripping with condescension. Emma remained rooted, her hands resting lightly on the podium. Her professionalism was unshaken despite the overt power play unfolding before her. She had encountered prejudice many times in her career, but this was different. This was blatant, happening publicly in the very system she had dedicated her life to upholding. The atmosphere in the courtroom thickened with tension. Other defendants shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their faces reflecting a mix of sympathy and unease. Behind the judge's bench, Leonard Brown, the seasoned bailiff, stood motionless, his jaw tightening as he observed yet another instance of the judge's heavy-handedness. At the court clerk's desk, Margaret Daniels, a middle-aged woman with over a decade of experience in Judge Monroe's courtroom, hesitated as she typed. Something about the situation didn't sit right with her. She had witnessed this pattern too many times, and now, without thinking, she opened a separate document on her computer to log the incident in her personal notes. The judge leaned forward in his high-backed chair, his stern expression illuminated by the sunlight streaming through the tall windows. The light cast sharp shadows across his face, making him appear even more imposing. "Miss Walker," he announced, his voice echoing through the now silent room, "this court hereby finds you in contempt and imposes a fine of $500. He paused, letting the weight of the penalty hang in the air. It was one of the steepest fines he had handed out for tardiness that year, though he offered no acknowledgement of this fact. Emma stood motionless, her mind meticulously documenting every detail. She noted how Judge Monroe's gaze never quite met hers, how his tone carried a patronizing edge that she had come to recognize all too well. It wasn't just a reprimand. It was a performance meant to assert dominance, rooted in bias, disguised as authority. Margaret Daniels typed the fine into the court system with deliberate keystrokes, her discomfort growing with every second. Just last week, she recalled, a white male attorney had arrived nearly 20 minutes late without explanation and received only a verbal warning. "Let this serve as a lesson in responsibility," Judge Monroe added, lifting a piece of paper from his desk and pretending to skim it. The gesture was clearly for show. The justice system relies on order and respect. Without punctuality, we have chaos. In the gallery, the other defendants watched in stunned silence. A young white woman in a business suit glanced at her watch, recalling that she, too, had been late, yet the judge had made no mention of it. An elderly black man shook his head subtly, recognizing the all-too-familiar scene. Leonard Brown, the bailiff, kept his posture professional, but his clenched jaw betrayed his frustration. Over his 15 years of service, he had silently tallied countless similar incidents. Today's fine was not just unusually harsh, it was blatantly unfair. Emma took a measured breath, her years in federal court flashing through her mind. She had faced some of the country's toughest defense attorneys, prosecuted high-profile criminals, and navigated the complexities of the legal system. But this was different. This wasn't just about her. It was a stark, public example of how prejudice could distort the very framework of justice. This moment, Emma knew, was no longer just about a parking ticket. It was a reflection of something much larger, a systemic problem that needed to be addressed. And as she stood there, silent yet resolute, she realized that the judge's next words were about to set off a chain reaction he couldn't possibly foresee. As Judge Albert Monroe leaned back in his chair, reveling in his display of authority, Emma Walker discreetly reached into her bag and retrieved her phone. She opened a note and carefully documented the exact time, the amount of the fine, and every word the judge had spoken. This wasn't just about a late fee, it was about something much larger. Judge Monroe, evidently settling into his role as disciplinarian, added with a sharp edge, "You'll pay this fine before leaving the courthouse today. We wouldn't want you to be late on that as well." A few nervous chuckles rippled through the courtroom, but the tension quickly swallowed them. The sunlight filtering through the windows shifted, illuminating Emma's face as she stood at the podium. Her expression remained neutral and professional, but her eyes carried a quiet intensity, a strength that might have made a more discerning judge reconsider his tone. For years, Emma had devoted herself to pursuing justice, building cases with precision, and navigating the intricacies of the law. And now, Judge Monroe, oblivious to the implications, was giving her everything she needed to expose the systemic flaws embedded in his courtroom. "Do you understand the fine as I have explained it?" Judge Monroe asked, his tone expectant, as if he anticipated a meek acknowledgement. Emma's reply came measured and deliberate. "Yes, Your Honor, I understand completely." Her voice betrayed nothing of her thoughts. She had long since learned the power of restraint, of documenting quietly, observing carefully, and waiting for the right moment to act. Satisfied, the judge nodded brusquely and reached for the next case file. To him, their interaction was over. What he failed to notice was how Emma's fingers moved quickly over her phone, sending a concise message to her office. He didn't realize that his words, his tone, and the glaring inconsistencies in his treatment of defendants had just become evidence in a much larger reckoning. The courtroom remained heavy with unspoken tension as Judge Monroe shifted his attention to the next case. But Emma wasn't finished, not by a long shot. The next few minutes would unravel the careful facade of his courtroom, and he didn't even see it coming. Emma opened her briefcase with steady hands, and the atmosphere in the room shifted perceptibly. She withdrew a leather credential holder, the golden federal seal embossed on its surface catching the sunlight. "Your Honor," Emma began, her voice carrying a new and undeniable authority. The entire room froze, the hum of the ceiling fans suddenly louder in the silence. "Before we proceed, I'd like to properly introduce myself for the record." Judge Monroe, mid-sentence on another case, paused, his hand frozen over the file. Emma held up her credentials, the gold badge of the United States Department of Justice gleaming unmistakably. "I am Assistant United States Attorney Emma Walker, currently serving the Northern District of Georgia." The reaction was immediate and dramatic. Judge Monroe's face, flush with self-assured authority moments earlier, drained of color. His hand faltered, the file slipping slightly in his grip. Margaret Daniels, the court clerk, stopped typing mid-word, her fingers hovering above the keyboard. She glanced from Emma to the judge, her eyes wide with disbelief. Leonard Brown, the bailiff who had watched countless such interactions over the years, couldn't help but let a small, satisfied smile tug at the corner of his mouth. This was a moment he would carry with him for a long time. Judge Monroe stammered, his voice unsteady for the first time that morning. He finally looked at Emma, really looked at her. He saw not just a young black woman standing before him, but a polished professional. Her demeanor calm yet commanding, her tailored blazer spotless, and her federal credentials an undeniable testament to her authority. "I apologize for my tardiness this morning," Emma continued, her voice unwavering. "I was delayed due to an urgent federal matter requiring my immediate attention." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the room. "The Carter human trafficking prosecution," she added, her tone factual. "I trust Your Honor is familiar with the case." The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Even the faint whirring of the ceiling fans seemed to fade. For the first time all morning, Judge Monroe appeared uncertain. He straightened in his chair, clearing his throat as if trying to regain control. His authoritative facade was crumbling, piece by piece, under the weight of Emma's calm yet firm presence. The gallery was transfixed. Some leaned forward slightly, not wanting to miss a single word. Margaret Daniels, frozen just moments before, resumed typing with newfound urgency. Leonard Brown stood a little taller, his posture now one of quiet pride. He had seen countless defendants subjected to Judge Monroe's arbitrary authority. But this was different. Emma Walker stood firm, her presence in the courtroom no longer that of a mere defendant. She had shifted the dynamic entirely. And as the sunlight continued to pour through the windows, casting her in a resolute glow, it became clear to everyone in the room that this was only the beginning. "I was delayed due to an urgent federal case requiring immediate attention," Emma Walker stated, her voice steady but firm. "The Carter human trafficking prosecution, which I'm sure Your Honor has seen covered in the news." She paused, allowing the gravity of her statement to sink in. The room felt electrified, the tension palpable. "I have written confirmation from the U.S. Attorney's Office, which I am happy to provide to the court." The young white woman who had arrived late earlier slid lower in her seat, her cheeks flushing as though she were an unintentional extra in a high-stakes courtroom drama. Meanwhile, the elderly black man in the back of the gallery straightened, pride evident on his face. This was a moment he'd waited decades to witness. Judge Monroe opened his mouth, then closed it again, his usual commanding presence faltering. Finally he stammered, Attorney Walker, He fumbled with the papers on his desk, suddenly looking much smaller in his elevated chair. Emma didn't wait for him to regain control. "Your Honor," she interrupted, her tone unwavering but respectful. "My position shouldn't matter. What does matter is the equal application of justice." She placed her credentials on the podium with a deliberate motion, then pulled out her phone. "This morning, I've documented several troubling patterns in the court's proceedings, including the disparate treatment of defendants based on their race and perceived social status." Judge Monroe's pale complexion shifted to a light green as her words landed. As a municipal court judge, he understood the magnitude of a federal prosecutor calling out such inequities, and his mind raced, replaying the morning's events. Suddenly, he saw them in a different light. "Perhaps," he said quickly, his voice losing some of its edge, "we could discuss this matter in chambers. And of course the fine is dismissed." "No, Your Honor," Emma replied firmly, her voice carrying the weight of countless moments of prejudice she'd encountered in her career. "The fine should not be dismissed simply because of my position. That would only serve to reinforce the systemic bias I'm bringing to light. Instead, I believe this is an opportunity to have a broader conversation about equal treatment under the law." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Many of the spectators had their phones in hand, despite the prohibition on recording, instinctively wanting to capture the moment. This was a story they would tell their children. A day when someone stood up and named the inequality they'd all felt but rarely been able to prove. Margaret Daniels, the court clerk, was typing at lightning speed now, her fingers dancing over the keyboard. Over the years, she'd witnessed Judge Monroe berate countless defendants, but this was the first time she'd seen him face such a direct and precise challenge to his authority. The sunlight, now fully streaming through the courtroom windows, illuminated the scene like a spotlight on a theater stage. Judge Monroe slumped slightly in his chair, his authority unraveling under the weight of Emma's calm, calculated words. At the podium, Emma Walker stood tall, her poise and professionalism transforming her from a defendant into a champion of justice before the eyes of everyone present. The courtroom had shifted. The simple matter of a parking ticket had become a pivotal moment, a reckoning that could no longer be dismissed. Judge Monroe cleared his throat, the sound breaking the heavy silence. His discomfort was obvious as he shuffled papers and adjusted his glasses. "Attorney Walker," he began, his voice noticeably softer now, "allow me to apologize for this unfortunate misunderstanding." He pressed a button to call his clerk. "We'll have this fine removed from the record immediately." Emma's posture remained straight, her expression unchanged. "Your Honor," she said, her tone measured and deliberate, "I respectfully decline the dismissal of the fine." A ripple of surprise swept through the room, punctuated by quiet gasps and exchanged glances. "Instead," Emma continued, "I believe this provides a crucial opportunity to address the larger issue at hand." The courtroom fell into stunned silence. Even Margaret Daniels stopped typing for a moment, her fingers hovering above the keyboard. Emma took a breath and pressed forward. "This morning, I observed several defendants arrive late. The treatment they received varied significantly. In particular, I noted disparities in how individuals were addressed, reprimanded, and penalized, depending on their race and apparent status." Judge Monroe's face darkened with embarrassment, his earlier bluster nowhere to be found. "This isn't just about me," Emma added, her voice steady and clear. "It's about ensuring the justice system lives up to its name, for everyone." As she spoke, the elderly man in the gallery nodded, a tear glinting in his eye. He had seen decades of inequality in courtrooms, but this moment felt different. Margaret Daniels resumed typing furiously, determined to record every word of the exchange. Leonard Brown, the bailiff, stood straighter than ever, pride shining in his expression. Judge Monroe fidgeted in his chair, visibly cornered. The courtroom, once under his firm control, now felt like it belonged to Emma. The balance of power had shifted, and the next words spoken would ripple far beyond those walls. This was no longer about a parking ticket. It was about challenging the very foundation of systemic bias and demanding accountability from a system that had long avoided it. "I would like to address the larger issue at hand," Emma Walker announced, her voice calm but firm. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Defendants leaned forward in their seats, sensing the significance of the moment. Margaret Daniels, the court clerk, had frozen mid-typing, her fingers suspended above the keys. Across the room, Leonard Brown, the experienced bailiff, took a measured step closer to the center of the courtroom, recognizing the historical weight of what was unfolding. Emma reached for her phone, holding it up as she spoke. "This morning, I observed 7 individuals enter this courtroom after the 9 a.m. session had begun. Of those 7, she paused, letting the room settle into her words. 3 were white professionals who received no reprimand or even a comment. 2 were Asian students who were given verbal warnings, and 2 were black individuals, myself included, who were subjected to the harshest penalties." Judge Albert Monroe's face flushed, though this time the color was from embarrassment, not authority. His grip on his gavel tightened as he shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Now, Miss Attorney Walker," he began, his voice faltering as he attempted to reassert control. "These are very serious allegations you're making. I can assure you that this court treats everyone equally." Emma's expression remained unshaken as she replied, "The evidence, Your Honor, suggests otherwise." She turned slightly, addressing the entire room. "In fact," she continued, her tone crisp, "I've already forwarded a detailed report to my office. As an officer of the federal court, I am obligated to document and report patterns of discriminatory behavior in the justice system." In the back of the room, a young law student scribbled frantically in her notebook, her eyes wide. This was the kind of real-world lesson no classroom could replicate. Nearby, the elderly black man who had been watching earlier wiped a tear from his eye. Decades of witnessing similar injustices had made this moment feel like a long-awaited reckoning. Judge Monroe shifted again, his composure cracking with every second. "What exactly are you proposing, Attorney Walker?" he asked, his tone betraying his growing unease. Emma placed both hands firmly on the podium, her voice ringing with conviction. "I propose 3 immediate actions, Your Honor. First," she began, raising a single finger, "I will pay the $500 fine, not because it is fair, but because it will serve as documented evidence of today's proceedings." She raised a second finger. "Second, I request that this court review the last 6 months of contempt charges and fines issued here, specifically analyzing them for demographic disparities." Judge Monroe's face paled visibly as she continued. "And third," Emma concluded, lifting a third finger, "I recommend mandatory bias training for all court personnel, including the bench." The room was silent, but the tension was electric. Margaret Daniels resumed typing, her pace now feverish as she worked to capture every word of the exchange. Leonard Brown nodded slightly, his expression one of quiet affirmation. This wasn't the first time he'd witnessed something like this, but it was the first time someone with Emma's authority had directly challenged it. "Those suggestions," Judge Monroe began, his voice shaky as he attempted to regain control, "while well-meaning, seem rather extreme for what amounts to a simple matter of tardiness." "With all due respect, Your Honor," Emma responded, her tone unwavering, "what is truly extreme is the ongoing pattern of racial bias in our courts. As a federal prosecutor, I've seen how small injustices like these accumulate, creating systemic barriers to justice for marginalized communities." She reached into her briefcase, withdrawing her checkbook. "I will pay the fine now, and my office will follow up regarding the review of this court's records." Her words carried neither anger nor resentment. Instead, they were spoken with the precision and authority of someone who had spent years learning how to navigate and challenge injustice from within the system. The sunlight poured through the tall windows, bathing the courtroom in golden light. Judge Monroe, who had once appeared commanding in his elevated chair, now seemed diminished. The power dynamic had shifted, and everyone present felt the change. By late afternoon, the events of the morning had spread like wildfire through Atlanta's legal community. Emails and text messages buzzed among lawyers and court staff. "Did you hear what happened in Judge Monroe's courtroom?" became the question of the day. The details passed from person to person. A federal prosecutor standing firm, challenging systemic inequality head-on, and turning an ordinary parking ticket case into a rallying cry for justice reform. Emma Walker's stand had become more than just a personal triumph. It had ignited the spark of change, It began with a text message from the young law student who had witnessed everything in Judge Albert Monroe's courtroom. She sent it to her study group. Just saw something unbelievable at municipal court. A federal prosecutor exposed the judge's racial bias. You won't believe what happened. Meanwhile, Emma Walker sat in her federal office, reviewing documents for the Carter trafficking case, when her phone began buzzing incessantly. Calls started pouring in. First from black attorneys in Atlanta who wanted to share their own experiences with Judge Monroe. Many admitted they had remained silent for years, fearing the repercussions speaking out might have on their careers. "This isn't just about me," Emma told her colleague, Marcus Taylor, another federal prosecutor who had stopped by to check on her. "For every attorney who deals with this, think about how many regular citizens suffer in silence." She handed Marcus her phone, showing him the flood of messages from lawyers across the city, all detailing similar patterns of bias. At the courthouse, Margaret Daniels, the court clerk, sat in the break room with a small group of staff members. "I've been keeping my own records," she confessed, her voice trembling slightly as she pulled out a worn notebook from her desk drawer. "Every time I saw something that didn't feel right, I wrote it down. Dates, names, fines, everything." Her hands shook as she shared what she had kept hidden for years. By early evening, local news stations had picked up the story. Outside the courthouse, Michael Chen, a reporter for Channel 5 News, stood with his crew, preparing for the evening broadcast. Sources inside the courthouse confirmed that this morning, a federal prosecutor was fined $500 for being late to court, Michael reported. But what happened next has ignited a citywide conversation about bias in our justice system. The story quickly spread across social media. Hashtags like Judge Monroe and Justice for All trended in Atlanta. Former defendants began sharing their own experiences in Judge Monroe's courtroom, many recounting similar stories of harsh treatment, often linked to their race. That evening, Judge Monroe sat in his home, his television tuned to the news. His phone had been ringing non-stop with calls from other judges, the Judicial Review Board, and reporters seeking comment. After 3 decades on the bench, his career was now under intense scrutiny. In her office, Emma received another call. This time, it was from Sharon Green, a prominent civil rights attorney. "We've been trying to document patterns like this for years," Sharon said, her tone urgent. "But coming from a federal prosecutor, someone who experienced it firsthand, this changes everything. Would you be willing to speak at a press conference tomorrow?" Elsewhere in the courthouse, clerks were quietly pulling records of Judge Monroe's past cases. Whispers spread as they began noticing patterns. Emma Walker found herself inundated with requests in the days following her stand in court. Legal organizations invited her to speak at their conferences, civil rights groups sought her expertise in documenting similar cases, and law schools asked her to lecture on confronting systemic bias from within the system. Sitting at her desk, Emma opened her laptop and began drafting a formal complaint to the Judicial Qualifications Commission. This wasn't just about Judge Albert Monroe or a single incident anymore. It was about addressing a systemic issue that cried out for reform. Her determination grew with every word she typed, her focus sharpened by the knowledge that this was no longer a personal battle, but a catalyst for change in a flawed system. As she worked, her phone buzzed with a message. It was from a young black law student who had witnessed her courtroom stand. "Thank you for showing us that we can fight the system from within. You've given us hope," the message read. 1 week later, the Judicial Qualifications Commission launched a formal investigation into Judge Monroe's conduct. On the 10th floor of the State Justice Building, the large conference room buzzed with activity. Investigators surrounded a long table piled with stacks of court records spanning the past 5 years. Linda Chavez, the lead investigator with 2 decades of experience, studied a spreadsheet on her laptop. "Look at these numbers," she said, pointing at the screen. In traffic cases, black defendants paid an average fine of $450, while white defendants paid $150 for the same offenses. She sighed and adjusted her glasses. And that's just the start. Down the hall in a small interview room, Margaret Daniels sat nervously clutching her personal notebook. For 12 years, she had worked as Judge Monroe's court clerk, quietly documenting every troubling incident she'd witnessed. "I noticed the pattern during my first year," she explained to the investigators, her hands trembling slightly as she flipped through her notes. "The way he spoke to people, it was different. His tone, the words he used, even how much time he gave them to explain their cases. It all depended on what they looked like." The investigation expanded beyond just fines. Dozens of former defendants, attorneys, and court staff were interviewed. Leonard Brown, the veteran bailiff, submitted a detailed written statement recounting hundreds of incidents over his 15 years of service. "Some days, I'd count how many times he interrupted black defendants compared to white ones," Leonard wrote. "The difference was staggering. Black defendants were interrupted 5 times more often on average." At the federal courthouse, Emma continued her regular work prosecuting cases. However, her office had become a hub for people eager to share their experiences. Young lawyers brought records of their encounters with judicial bias, while community activists delivered stacks of complaints that had previously gone ignored. "We need to organize all of this," Emma told her assistant, gesturing to the growing pile of evidence on her desk. "Every story matters. Every incident counts. This isn't just about one judge, it's about changing the whole system." As the investigation deepened, even more troubling patterns emerged. Black women faced the highest fines on average. Cases involving minority defendants were processed 40% faster, often at the expense of thorough consideration. Requests for payment plans were denied 3 times more often for minorities. Witnesses supporting minority defendants were interrupted significantly more frequently. Judge Monroe was called in for questioning multiple times. Each session revealed more about his unconscious biases. Confronted with the data, he appeared genuinely shaken. "I've always prided myself on being fair," he said during one interview, his voice softer than his usual courtroom tone. "I never realized. I didn't mean for any of this to happen." The admission hung in the air, a quiet acknowledgement of the harm caused by years of unchecked behavior. For Emma, the investigation was proof of the power of persistence and evidence. As she reviewed the stories flooding her office, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The fight wasn't over, but the momentum was undeniable. This wasn't just about holding one judge accountable. It was about reshaping a system that had failed for too long. I didn't realize," Judge Albert Monroe said, his voice subdued. For the first time, he seemed to grasp the profound impact of his actions. The investigation into his conduct had uncovered a disturbing truth. Similar patterns of bias existed in the rulings of several other judges in the district. What began as an inquiry into one courtroom had grown into an exposé of systemic injustice. By the 3rd week, Linda Chavez and her investigative team had assembled a 300-page report. Packed with statistics, testimonies, and analyses of thousands of cases, the document left no room for doubt. "This report doesn't show isolated incidents," Linda explained to the commission board as she laid the hefty report on the table. "It reveals a pervasive pattern of systemic bias that has silently affected thousands of lives over many years. And perhaps most alarming, this bias often operates so quietly that even those perpetuating it may not fully recognize their role." As the investigation reached its conclusion, one thing became indisputable. Emma Walker's case had forced open a door that had been tightly sealed for decades. Behind it lay a history of discrimination, inequality, and unchecked bias, finally brought into the light. The question now wasn't just about the consequences for Judge Monroe, it was about how to dismantle a system that had allowed such disparities to persist. Fixing it would require more than punishing one man. It demanded a comprehensive reimagining of justice itself. 3 months after Emma Walker stepped into Judge Monroe's courtroom, the landscape of Atlanta's justice system had begun to change. The morning sun streamed through the windows of the city's main courthouse as workers installed a sign that read, "Center for Judicial Education and Equity Training." Judge Monroe was no longer on the bench. After the investigation's findings, he had been given a choice: resign or face a public hearing. He chose resignation. Surprisingly, this was not the end of his story. "I never saw my own bias," Judge Monroe admitted to a room full of judges during the first mandatory bias training session. Standing at the podium, he looked like a different man, his voice humbled, his posture less rigid. "I thought fairness meant treating everyone the same, but I never took the time to examine how my background and assumptions shaped my decisions." In the back of the room, Emma watched silently. She hadn't anticipated this outcome when she stood her ground in his courtroom months ago. Next to her sat Margaret Daniels, the former court clerk, now promoted to head a newly established court monitoring program. The changes extended beyond Judge Munro's courtroom. New policies required all courts in the district to maintain detailed records of fines, sentences, and judicial behavior. An independent committee, composed of community members, legal experts, and civil rights advocates, reviewed these records monthly. Leonard Brown, the veteran bailiff, had been appointed to lead a new training program for court officers. Standing before his first class of trainees, he spoke with conviction. "We are the eyes and ears of the courtroom," he told them. "It's our duty to speak up when we see unfair treatment. The days of staying silent are over." Back in her federal prosecutor's office, Emma gazed at a framed receipt hanging on her wall, the $500 fine she had refused to let be dismissed. It had become a symbol of transformation, reminding her and others that one person's stand could spark change. Below it was a new photo. Emma surrounded by a group of law students she now taught in a weekly seminar on ethics and bias in the legal system. Elsewhere, the local bar association had launched a new reporting system for lawyers to document instances of bias. In its first month, the system had received over 200 reports. Each one was investigated thoroughly, helping to uncover broader trends and address them proactively. The ripples of change weren't confined to Atlanta. Other cities began adopting similar reforms: mandatory bias training for judges and staff, regular audits to identify disparities, and community oversight committees to hold courts accountable. The movement Emma had catalyzed didn't just challenge a broken system, it reimagined it entirely. And as she returned to her work, she knew this was only the beginning. The road to justice was long, but for the first time, it felt possible to walk it. The system had received over 200 reports in its first month, each one thoroughly investigated. This effort painted a clear picture of the systemic issues and where reforms were needed. "It's not just about punishing bad behavior," Emma Walker explained to a reporter during an interview. "It's about transforming how we think about justice. Every person who steps into a courtroom deserves respect, regardless of their race, gender, or background." The ripple effects of change weren't confined to Atlanta. Other cities began implementing similar measures: mandatory bias training for judges and staff, regular audits to identify racial disparities in rulings, and community oversight committees to review court practices. Law schools introduced required diversity and equity training for students, ensuring the next generation of lawyers and judges entered the profession with greater awareness. Exactly 3 months after Emma had stood in Judge Munro's courtroom, she received a letter. It was from the young law student who had witnessed that pivotal moment. "Your courage that day changed my life," the student wrote. "It showed me that change is possible. And sometimes, all it takes is one person willing to say, 'This isn't right.'" The student shared that she was now pursuing a career in civil rights law and had started a legal clinic at her school to assist people who faced discrimination in court. Elsewhere, the elderly black man who had been in the courtroom that day returned to visit the courthouse. Slowly walking the halls, he noticed the changes. Signs in multiple languages welcomed visitors. A help desk provided free legal guidance. Even the security guards greeted everyone with a smile. "I've been coming to this courthouse for 40 years, he told a young clerk at the help desk, his voice thick with emotion. "This is the first time I've felt like justice might actually be blind." Back in her office, Emma's phone buzzed. It was a message from the Judicial Review Board, inviting her to lead a new commission on court reform. As she read the message, she thought back to that morning 3 months ago. What had started as a simple stand for fairness had grown into a movement. In the main courthouse lobby, a new plaque had been installed. It read, "Justice is not just about the law. It's about how we treat each person who walks through these doors." Below the inscription was the date Emma Walker had entered Judge Munro's courtroom and sparked a wave of change that was still growing.